Hi, good morning everyone, and it's lovely to be back here in the Netherlands. I started my open air journey in Alkmaar with the Code 24 guys before they were Code 24. That's almost 15 years ago, I think, a long time ago, and with Gerard Fredericks, who's here. Had a very happy afternoon arguing with Gerard, and we've continued arguing ever since. But we had a good hug when we met. We get on well. So Joost and I are going to talk a little bit about the clinical modelling aspect of open air, trying to give you a sense of what the governance arrangements are and how it pans out in the real world. So just a little bit about my background. So as Wouter said, I'm originally a GP, and I was a bit of a techie GP. I was a bit of a hacker like Eric, and I actually fell into open air accidentally. I was really trying to build some clever new UI. I'm not very good at UX design, but I thought I could do something clever with my GP system, which I didn't like. And in order to build the UI, I needed some data models to run them on. Went around looking for some data models and found this weird open air thing. Didn't understand it at all, put it down for 2 years, and then came back into my head, and I've been hooked ever since. So I spent roughly the last 15 years of my life working on open air projects. Mostly doing consultancy, training, working with companies like Beta and Vita, Code 24, around Europe and around the world. So it changed my world. You know, I went from sitting in my room at home to being able to travel all over Europe. It's been a real privilege. I spent some time on the open air board. I just stood down from that. I just felt it was time for new blood to come in. So it's a privilege and a pleasure. So just while I'm doing the promotional bit, we've been involved in the training. Traditionally, we do face-to-face training over a couple of days. We found when it came to the lockdown and COVID, doing this kind of detailed clinical modelling training is really hard to do over Teams or Zoom. So we committed to transferring everything to video, and we've just done a training course that our partners Rosaldo, who some of you heard of, the Finnish company, are going to release. And so we're quite excited about that because it's a new kind of way of working for us. So we'll be pleased to see how that goes. Anyway, I'm going to talk about the clinical modelling environment that we work in, because it is different. It's different from the way that Fireworks or other standards-based organisations have worked, and is a little bit challenging. I'm still convinced we've got this right for what we are trying to do. That doesn't mean that what Fire is trying to do is wrong, because as Eric, I think, was really nicely explained, they are trying to do different things. There is overlap, without a doubt, but the end game in each is a little bit different. So I think ours is optimized for this future, what I believe is patient-centric architectures and patient-centric federated data platforms. I think that's where we're headed, whatever the technology stack is. And I think open air modeling methodology has the best proven capacity to build out the very detailed content we're going to need to support that. I'm going to talk about around this respect form. So respect is a DNA CPR. Do you want to be resuscitated at the end of your life? It was introduced into the UK about 6 or 7 years ago because of some very difficult cultural issues about the previous generation of that. And I'm sure it's the same in every country. You know, it's a very difficult process. All through COVID, there were all sorts of anxieties about patients having inappropriate do not resuscitate orders. So it remains a difficult subject for everyone to talk about. And we were introduced to, there we go. We were introduced to the respect form some years ago, but just a little starter on the open air modelling environment. As Eric nicely explained, it is all underpinned by this thing we call the reference model, which is really the techies world. This is the world, Peter and Nedap, Sebastian and Code 24, the technical people in this world. That's what they build. Little bits of it we use in our clinical modelling world, but much of it is just the technical infrastructure. But we do use things like the data types and basic structures. That is built in a typical technical architecture. It uses UML and specifications, and the guys will go and write software built on that. It hardly ever changes. It's gone from version 1.1 to I think 1.10 in the last 10 years. So it's absolutely rock solid state. The main bit in my world, my daily world, is this other layer. the clinical information model, which is deliberately kept separate. Now that's quite different from FHIR or any other modeling methodology other than the 13606, which also splits. And that's what makes openEHR interesting and different. The main thing is that all of this clinical information level is completely governed separately and is driven by, well, we say clinicians, but it's really mostly clinical informaticians like myself. You know, people who've got a clinical background or clinical information background, and that's their specialty. So archetypes and templates, these are open source computable models. They are, I guess, if you're familiar with the ZIBs and each they are, you know, little nuggets, components. What's a blood pressure? What's a lab test? What's a DNA CPR order? These are all examples of archetypes. So they're components, Lego bricks for the health record, but they are immediately computable. We can load them up into openEHR data repositories and they work right away. And that's one of the really interesting things about openEHR technology. This is essentially a low-code data handling data layer. Nobody has to do any engineering. If I build a new archetype or deploy an archetype, I don't have to go to an engineer to get that deployed into the system. I simply upload the archetype, and you'll see the template definitions, into the data, the smart data store, and it will just work. So familiar components, and then we bring these together in what we call templates. And templates are essentially the user level data set. So if we have a blood pressure and a pulse oximetry archetypes, they might be brought together for a typical nursing word round where, you know, the nurse takes the pulse and the blood pressure, etc. We would combine these into a template, and because one of the things we do in archetypes is to use this idea of a maximal data set, and Eric explained that already. You know, we try to do everything. What does anybody around the world want to do about blood pressure? Not just what a GP might want to do, or a hospital doctor, any kind of clinician, or indeed the patient. So we have this kind of idea of a maximal data set in the archetypes. But then once it comes to real world use, actually individual practitioners or individual use cases don't need all these little data points. So we take a lot of these out. We call it constraining out in the template. So the template is shaping the raw archetypes to fit the actual use case. So many archetypes shaped by templates, and it's the templates that we actually upload into these CVR data repositories. So just a comment about digital health standardization, and this is broader than openEHR. These are some universals. It's always distributed and it's always evolutionary. So again, Eric did a great job of explaining some of the differences between openEHR and FHIR. And I see some of those criticisms of FHIR as well, you know, oh, there's so many, but actually we have the same problems in openEHR. We just have them a little less in some places and a little more in others. So there's always this problem that you cannot fix international standards in healthcare and IT and have them work at local level. So you have to have kind of half-baked, you know, in the UK, I'm sure in the Netherlands, you can no such horrors, but we have like half-baked bread. You know, you take home and you finish it off at home. And all international healthcare IT standards are like that. And it's really a case of how much baking is done up front. And so the differences in openEHR and FHIR are where the baking is done. It's always a trade-off because there always is localization and there is always change. And actually, this is a hugely complex problem space that we've only partially mapped. We think we have a much better way of mapping out this problem space with openEHR. And I think Eric is correct that, you know, we're making much more progress, let's say, than the FHIR guys, partly because they didn't intend to cover that data space. It was about let's go for the maximum value, the 80-20 of what people want to exchange. In openEHR, we are trying to boil the ocean. We're saying, because we're having to store data and manage the data stores ourselves, we have to handle any kind of data that any little application around the world wants to build. So by definition, we have to scale up to that breadth of content and conclusion. So there's always this balance between what you can mandate internationally or advise or define internationally, what you can make work at a national level, and then as an individual application developer who has to deliver a product to the customer, you're going to have other tensions. So this is the bit that's different about openEHR. We have a very distributed way This is in the archetypes and templates. So again, the reference model is kind of traditionally modeled as a very small group of people who take change requests. It's the way that the reference model is updated is like any typical open source technical project. But archetypes are a little bit different. What we have is a very distributed way of working. Each archetype is its own little governance entity. It's individually versioned, it's individually managed. We tend to have a group of editors around there who kind of manage the change requests for each archetype. We sometimes bundle them together in sort of thematic projects, so that might be medication archetypes, lab test archetypes, and the editors will be in common across those, and it's their job to do that. But it's basically devolved down to pretty small groups of editors who decide when an archetype is good enough to publish, and they bring together a group of reviewers. But it's all passed out. There isn't one group internationally that's handling all this. It's federated. It's federated internationally, and then there's other work done nationally, and then there's further work done in each individual vendor or application space. We use tooling to support this. This is a commercial tool produced by Ocean Health Systems, who've given us essentially a free copy to use in the international space. So this is where most of the international work is done. It stands as a library of international archetypes called CKM, Clinical Knowledge Manager, but it's also a review tool. It allows people to contribute to the reviews internationally. So we've got many thousands of clinicians and other care professionals and indeed patients around the world. So we put the archetypes up for review. We let them comment on them. There are comments back, there's a dialogue, and eventually the editors say it's good to go. They put the green tick on it to say it's published, and then it goes under very strict version control. So that's what happens in international space. What happens more locally or nationally? So this is where we'll talk about the ReSPECT journey. So ReSPECT started off as a single form. It was initially, the openEHR journey on that was initially undertaken in Scotland, in the UK. And we helped build a bunch of archetypes and templates, actually based on some original UK standards. So that was the original ReSPECT template underpinning that form, and that's part of the application that was built on top of it. But then step forward a couple of years and that went into production. It's still working at the moment. But we thought maybe we can do better. Is it possible for us to take the core part of that story, which is, do you want to be resuscitated or not? Can we make that into an international archetype? Bearing in mind that this is a very difficult cultural issue. There are religious views on this, there are legal constraints in many different countries. Maybe this is pushing the idea of international collaboration too far. Bear in mind, FHIR has nothing like this in its resources. This is right in outer space from their point of view. And the great thing was, we managed to do it. And Joost was a big part of this. So to my surprise, we actually did manage to come up with an international archetype that covered CPR decisions and many of the other things around and about that. We're now, step back another year, we're now deploying that new archetype in two projects. One is one called Rosie, which is an end-of-life care project in the east of England. And that's the part of the form that we're building on top of that. That's the template that we're using, and you can see the advanced intervention decisions archetype there. And then finally, in the One London Urgent Care Plan, you're going to hear a little bit more about this from Gary McAllister, who's sent a video. So we've been working on this project as well, using the same archetype in a similar but different project. This is a different part of England. So we're using the same archetypes, but slightly different templates and actually slightly different code sets. And this is where, this is an evolutionary process. We can't make standards just work out of the box. We have to be patient and evolve things. So the first iteration of this One London Urgent Care Plan is not using SNOMED. And the real reason for that was that they already had an existing application with its own code sets. And we simply did not have time to do all of the, not just technical work, but also the clinical work to agree conversions to SNOMED. So we said, like right now, we'll use the architects, but we'll work with the original internal code sets. Next step, let's do the transition to SNOMED and align with other projects like Rosie. So that's my message, is that, you know, even though we think we've got this process a little bit slicker and better, it's still challenging. It takes time and we need to be patient. So that's where we're going. That's a really interesting project. I'm delighted to be working on it. I'm pretty sure it is going to go live. So just to summarize, developing these kind of standard healthcare models, whether you're using openEHR or FHIR or both, and I would say it is both. We freely borrow you know, ideas from the FHIR community, and we know they borrow back again. This is a big problem space. That picture is actually from Dutch navigators. It's their, I suspect, their third or fourth iteration to map Australia. You can see there seems to be a major gap missing. And I think that's where we are at the moment. In fact, I suspect we're not as far on as that. In terms of mapping the healthcare information space, you know, we're probably only getting a little tip of Australia at the moment. There's a lot of work to be done. And so I'm not at all proud about stealing ideas. If other people have got good data models, we'll use them. And we are actually using them within both of those projects I mentioned. Eventually, you do have to boil the ocean. If you're going to have this idea of data platforms and standardized persistence, you've got to be able to handle everything. And I think we have a really strong methodology to take this space forward and indeed work with our FHIR colleagues, because we can turn those detailed models into FHIR archetypes very easily. You know, Eric mentioned about the questionnaire resources, the kind of default go-to. It's really easy for us to create questionnaire resources out of openEHR archetypes and templates. And Diego, who's in the room, has done a lot of work in actually making that work technically. Lastly, just in terms of control, this is the big thing. Because the data models are not defined by the vendor and they're not locked into the technology, the data models are actually under control of the healthcare provider. So although I've been working as part of a consortium, you know, with the better guys to deliver those projects in London and in Rosie, I think of myself as working for the healthcare provider. They own the IP. In future, they'll be much more active in deciding what data models to go in as they grow out of those environments. And that's the big change. It puts the healthcare institution, or if you like the patient or whoever, not the vendor, in charge of not just the data, but the data models. And I'll hand over to Joost.
Good morning, everyone. Maybe we can take a brief moment because, as Ian mentioned, he's been the past co-chair for openEHR International, but he recently stepped down. He's been talking about retiring for some time, and try to hold him off because he's a really valuable person. It appears he's winning, so at least, Ian, thank you for your service on the openEHR. It's really an honor for me to be standing here speaking together with Ian, and it's really exciting to have this bigger group. Usually it's just my fiance, and she gets so fed up with my stories about openEHR and archetypes that she now asks me to use a code word instead of archetypes. I have to call them puppies in order for it to be fun for her and for me. So, hang on a second. So about me, I'm a practicing medical doctor, and I've loved IT since I was a little child. I was the one all the neighbors went to if the computer crashed down. And I was, as a doctor, really fed up with terrible information systems, very similar to Ian. And I was like, I need to do something about this. And that's when I joined Nedap about 3 years ago. And what I do is I talk to doctors who use our software to hear what should be improved. And for many of the problems, you realize that the cause, they ask for a button on the screen, but what you need for that is to have proper data models that capture the clinical concept. This is the stuff I love, to think out what's the blood pressure, what's all the concepts, and what's the impact in real use, and what's the clinical safety if you change something, stuff like that. If you want to know more about me, my LinkedIn is mostly up to date. So Nedap is a technology company. We were founded in 1929, and we are the leading EHR vendor for the Dutch care market, so like chipshops for hospitals, for everything but hospitals and GP, but nothing like chipsoft, because we put people first before our technology, and that's a really nice comparison with openEHR. We started with openEHR in 2015 because we realized we need to get quality data in order to do the really cool stuff that we mentioned before, like machine learning and getting data analysis, doing research on large data sets. Why it's the openness from Nedap, like put people first, you need to accept, as Ian said, that the healthcare practitioners, the organization should be in control of the data, not as us as an IT vendor. Sometimes it's a bit scary because if you open up all the data models, they can go to another vendor and ask for a better price or better features. But we believe we really need to do that because it's like a moral thing, because it's the patient's data. The practitioners work with the software every day, so they should be in control. But it's also the way to keep us pushing forward to always be the one step ahead of our competitors. Otherwise, you're going to get lazy and you think we're doing well, and you start grading down your software before you know. And I personally really love openEHR because it's clinician first. It's really oriented, designed. If you read the specifications, it's really about the doctor and the healthcare practitioner. It's almost like a handbook of medical informatics. I found it's really deep understanding. A lot deeper than most doctors. Doctors are usually experienced, trained. They don't think about too much how they do stuff. They just have learned to do it. So it's really impressive how Thomas Beal and Sam got this. Yeah. And as we mentioned before, the interoperability and standardization is being built in by the ground up, and I think it's the only way to do it. And what's really great, one of our core principles at Nedap is autonomy. We want to enable the users, we want to enable our colleagues to take control of your own life, of your own work, and be autonomous in the way you're working. And the good thing about openEHR is that usually autonomy and standardization, they conflict. If you want to standardize, you have to agree, and you cannot do something else, otherwise you will break the standard. But openEHR has found really a lot of flexibility here, where they can combine autonomy and standardization. And it's done by the 3-layer model, as Ian explained a bit. So the reference model is really standardized. They have to do them all the same way, the same vendors, by all the vendors to make it work. And you get a lot by that. If you adhere to the reference model, then you can share all the data natively. Most vendors can just render everything that's in the data. So whatever system you use to record the data, you can view it from any system. And yeah, it's easy to say it like that, but that has tremendous value because you can always work together, even if you don't agree on everything else about the archetypes, the templates, the UI, you can still always work with the data. The second level is the archetype level. So that's what Ian talked about, like what's a blood pressure, what's an advanced intervention decision, stuff like that. And if you use that, every vendor has a blood pressure model. So if you agree with all the vendors, as we have for many years in the CTN, to use the same archetype, and this is one of the key ideas, that the model is not different between vendors and between organizations. The model is the same in Australia as in Finland or in the Netherlands. The blood pressure is the same. It's the same physical phenomenon. So you should have the same model. And in order to facilitate all these differences, we need the maximum data set. So if somebody in Australia wants, I don't know, the position of the patient, well, not many people use that. You need to cater for that. And if you have this archetype, the really good thing is that you can, well, technical people call it querying. You can query the data, and the blood pressure will give the same result everywhere you use this archetype. So that's really, really powerful. And you can process the data. You can do whatever you want as a normal application on any data, on all the standardized archetypes. And finally, on the template level, you can tune it to your needs. And one of the things I really like is that even in the template, you can say, well, I'm a cardiologist, so I want for the blood pressure, I want the systolic, the diastolic, and maybe the location of the measurement. So that's what I need to give a good blood pressure measurement. But even if maybe some other cardiologists at the same hospital, they say, well, I always do these three things, but I also want to know whether the patient has had a meal recently, because I think that's really important. And you can still keep consistency for those three parts that are shared and even add your own. There's really a lot of autonomy there. You can decide how much standardization you want. And always you keep being able to view each other's data. So I want to show you quickly how easy it can be. So Ian already showed the advanced intervention decision from the International Clinical Knowledge Manager. On the right hand, so you download the file, just push the button and push the export button, you download the ADL file. On the right hand side is our editor, where you can upload the same file and you say, okay, for the resuscitation policy, for our users or our setting or for my patient, I do want the decision description and the CPR decision, but the rationale, I never put it in there. You push the exclude button, it will keep it pushes off the form and keep the rest standardized. And then you download this file, you go into our software, you upload it, and it shows it on the right hand side. So the data is the same in our layout as the one Ian said, and it's internationally standardized. Well, out of the box, there's been a lot of work going forward, but this can be done in an hour. Even simpler archetypes, like for example, we just this morning finished a review of the Karnofsky performance status, which is a really simple archetype. We got it reviewed in 2 weeks and half an hour editorial discussion because it's so simple. And you can just download the archetype from the CKM, put it into our software to also generate all the things around it you need, and you can have it up and running in minutes. We have not done it for this archetype, but we've done it for many others. But maybe one of our customers has already used this archetype because they have the liberty to do so. We don't know, we don't control it. They can just do it and keep, even without us controlling it or standardizing, they still keep standardization of the data. So it's really amazing. And in our experience, it's really good to know that most archetypes we need are already there in the CKM. I agree with Ian that there's still a lot to do, but like the core concepts, I think we've covered really a lot, maybe 90%. But of course, there are hundreds, maybe thousands of measurement scales, so they have not all been done, but that's not the hard thing to do, it just takes time. And as Nedap, we really appreciate all the work that's been done in the CKM. I think it's good to recognize Heather Leslie, who has done a really great job at making this a consistent set of archetypes in the CKM. So thank you for that, Heather. And it's really amazing the quality of the models. We hardly ever found a model with serious problems or where the key data point is missing. Just it's really amazing how well it works. So in recognition of that, we shared all our archetypes. Our product first was, our openEHR product was first centered around measurement scales. So we built many, I think I exaggerated a bit, 200, but all these archetypes, we shared them with the community for other people to work with them as a way to appreciate all the work that's been done. There is one thing though. In order to have both this autonomy and the standardization, openEHR is pretty complex. I spent really many Saturday mornings studying the specification to learn about it. It's not really fair because I also had to learn about health informatics, and there's a lot to learn in the specs, but still it takes a lot of time and not everybody wants to spend that time. Well, good thing is there's a lot of help available. The community is really friendly. On this course, you can ask many questions, beginner questions, advanced questions, and you always get friendly and timely response in my experience. And there's software available, so you don't have to understand all the openEHR tech in order to be able to use it. There's a Java library, open source, and there's an Airbase open source way to store all the data, so you don't have to build it yourself. There's YouTube courses online, and there's recently an education board being established that will progress this work and certify all the courses. So congratulations to everybody who's got elected to that board. But yeah, if you want to do it yourself, you need very smart people. So if you're one of them, you want to work on this, please contact us, because we're always looking for good people at Nedap. And finally, this openEHR is mostly like volunteer-based, like volunteers who do the editorial reviews and contribute to the specifications. So it's really important to give back to make this community viable. It's really nice to see all of you here showing interest and being here, sharing your thoughts maybe at the drinks. And there's many ways to contribute by writing software, making archetypes, being part of the specifications committee that determines changes to the reference model. We're an industry partner with already the zip mapping project, where we're working really closely with Code 24, which is really nice to work with a competitor. No, that's it. What I want to share. Thank you for your time, everyone.
Thank you, Joost. This is on. Yes, it is. Well, I really have to thank you again for working on the zip mapping. He just mentioned it very quickly, but we're working together with a competitor to take the data models with Code 24 here, who supported us also in Nedap. So that's amazing work that we need to put out, and it's all voluntarily work, so it's not that quick, but we can always use more modelers. That's one thing. We can take a couple of questions before we go for a quick break. One in the back, so I'll work my way there. Hi, on, please.
Yes, yeah, again, your presentation very interesting. I by far am not an expert, or even near in the openEHR, and I don't spend myself more than reading this back, so apologies for that. However, what is in essence the difference between a normative bioresource and your archetype? Because if I listen to the two communities, they both claim the same, they make the same claim. They say, hey, we agreed on a data model, we agreed on something we call normative, we have a whole process behind to come to a normative definition of a data type, prototype, and archetype. So what in essence now is the difference between the two? Or is there a difference?
Yeah, it's a good question. It's a hard one to answer, because there are many aspects in the differences. Maybe Ian, you got maybe a well prepared.
I would say in a normative resource and a normative archetype, a published archetype, there is actually almost no difference. So if you look at allergies, we actually dual modeled allergies with the fire gas. That was co-developed. Many of the other normative resources, the more clinical ones like procedure, Graham Reeve, who developed FHIR, he was working on openEHR at the time, so he freely acknowledges he used a lot of the area. So there already is a huge amount of convergence. Some of it is just natural. The medication stuff, which is something I've worked heavily on in both openEHR and FHIR, there just is convergence. So there's very little difference. Where it changes dramatically is when you get away from those core major clinical things. Even you know, like blood pressure, there is no blood pressure resource in FHIR. There is no pulse oximetry. There is nothing remotely like advanced intervention decisions or advanced directives. There's a huge problem space that FHIR goes, you know what, we're not going there. Not in terms of normative resources or concrete resources. And that's the difference, because it wasn't designed to do that. That was, I mean, explicitly I spoke to David Kramer, you know, who's the Dutch expert on this, and I asked him about, what do you do about all the other stuff? He said, well, we're not worried about that. We want to get those key things working, and that's the difference, and that's where we can fill the gap. You know, so people still think, you know, in the UK, I never said, you know, all of these projects we're involved with, there are FHIR interfaces. We're taking FHIR data from GP systems, we're pushing stuff out to other. So it's not an and or, it's both. That's the state of the art at the moment. Some very clever person will come up with a more blended model, but that could take decades. We should work with what we have at the moment. We'll make progress. If we don't get into this, you know, it must be one or the other.
Another question.
Can you tell something about the corporate organization? Archetypes, government levels. We're thinking about the oldest organization for information standards, which is quite complex. We have some institutes, we have SIPs, and we have a lot of different scientific communities, we have professionals. That's only on the Dutch map. So I'm wondering how it's organized.
I'm not sure the microphone was working properly, so I'll repeat the question for the people at home. So the question is about how we handle the governance of the archetypes, because it gets quite complex. Maybe this is also a good one for you.
You're just dodging all the questions. It's actually very challenging, and I think this is not an open air problem. It's a health informatics problem. So I've done a lot of work in the UK on fire curation as well. So I've seen the same problems from a slightly different perspective. You've got at an international level, I would say there's actually not very much you can do around standardization. You can half bake, you know, you can get to a resource, but you can't get to a profiled resource, which is what you need for fire. So there are limitations, and deliberately we don't try to overcook the products internationally. Once you get down to national level, it does become, you know, you can start to say, no, you must do blood pressure like this, or you must do DNA CPR like this. I think then there's still a problem of how much you actually can push through a central standards authority, whatever that is. And I've certainly been pushing that, as well as having, you know, something like Nictus, which is doing, you know, it's doing actually very good work in terms of the ZIPS work. You need something that's peer driven, so that people that are building models as part of their daily application build, as we are, can contribute to the process without necessarily the roadblocks. So something that's a little bit more relaxed. We're not trying to get something that's perfect or something that's good enough, and a number of different you know, commercial and other organizations can collaborate on to make better, so more peer publication processes rather than something that's really heavily controlled top down. It's not really the openEHR has quite liberal governance up top, then it gets tighter as you go down to national level.
Then you can get the diamonds.
Yes, yeah, exactly.
Yeah. So if you're interested in that, I think the Norwegian example is actually quite good. I'm trying to provide a link to some YouTube video from Celia when we distributed after the meeting. There are some good resources on how they did it, and they do it really like they have a national institute, but it's really bottom-up approach. So if there's a project, they model for that, and they make the effort to get clinicians together. It's an interesting story, but unfortunately, or maybe luckily, I would like to propose a break until 10 to 12. So it's a really quick break. So.